Okay. Alrighty, you can go to the next slide. So yeah, today's media training, which was based on requests from the chapters, will focus on the following things. We also just heard, feedback from you all about maybe various things that we can try to cover in the Q&A and discussion if we don't get to them through these slides. So first, we'll just start out by talking about different media types. Then we'll really go in depth in terms of a step-by-step process of how you can get media coverage for your action. This part will be led by Rachel, kind of talking about all of the behind the scenes stuff that Rachel and I do that really helps to amplify her actions when she goes out there and blocks trucks of weapons and blocks trains and blocks weapons expos, and how we're able to get international media coverage for those. Then we'll talk a little bit about letters to the editor and op-eds, which we've heard, several of you have experience writing those. So we'll kind of give a primer of that, and we can go more in depth if you want to. And then if we do have time at the end, we wanted to potentially go into breakout rooms and practice our elevator pitches, basically practicing how we can tell a story quickly, whether that's telling someone in a few sentences what World Beyond War is or what your campaign is. So we'll see if we have time for that at the end. And we've booked an hour and a half for this training. Yeah, we can go on to the next slide. So media types, this may be familiar to you at this point. I think we cover this in a few other trainings as well. It's helpful to kind of have in the back of your mind these three main types of media. The first is owned media. Essentially, those are channels that you own, that you control and can self-publish on. So your blog, your website, your Facebook page, your Facebook group, those are channels that you can control and can publish your own content. Paid media, that's media that you purchase. So the example of that would be like World Beyond War's billboard campaigns, Facebook ads that we might purchase. We're not really going to get into paid media today. The last one, which is kind of the major focus for today, is earned media. So a letter to the editor, an op-ed, those are examples of earned media where you've created the content, but then you're submitting it to an external platform and getting it published. And essentially that's a way that you can broaden your audience. Whereas with owned media, right, you're only speaking to your own audience. With earned media, you can get beyond your existing audience. Also, examples of earned media would be like when people share your content, like when someone retweets you on Twitter, or on when someone shares your post on Facebook or something. And like ideally, right, you want like a big known person with a big following to be able to share the content and reach a wider audience. Next slide. And I will turn it over to Rachel at this point to kind of dive into the second piece now of the step-by-step guide of how to get coverage for your actions. And this could be any type of action. It doesn't necessarily have to be kind of a direct action or a risky action. It could be, a rally or any kind of event that you're having. And we seem to have lost the slides.
Indeed.
All right, sorry, I've got it back there. So we could talk for hours about what is the current state of media in the world. I know I have ranted with maybe not hours, but for many minutes with many of you about this topic. I don't really want to do that as part of this workshop, because I think we're here to not just like bemoan the state of media, but to actually use it to the best of our ability and think about what we can do. But I will just say, regardless of what you think the state of media is where you live, people are consuming some kind of media, and it is really important to assess that. Usually the easiest type of media coverage to get is what's local to you. And I think that's like a really smart place to start for most chapters. And then of course it can always end up being syndicated more widely. But when I say assess local media context, I really mean to really think about it. Like, how do the people in your town or city hear about the news? And don't forget things like radio stations that people listen to while they're driving. Don't forget things like maybe the free papers that are giving it out in your subway station. Like, think about in general and make a list of what are the newspapers, the magazines, the radio shows, etc. And start locally. What is your local news context? For a lot of the other steps that we're going to talk about next, you need to actually have a list of the media outlets that you are hoping will cover what you are doing. So to actually write down these and then begin to think of what are the contact numbers, emails, how do you get in touch with these media outlets? Ideally, you're also listing actual reporters. Who is the person who seems to cover the community events that happen where you live, whether that's, I don't know, like a big sale at a school, or whether that's like a protest, or whether that's what the local mayor is saying, to start to list out who are the reporters who do this sort of work. And ideally, you're building relationships with them over time. That can look like lots of different ways. If you're on social media, you should certainly be following them there. Social media could be a whole other workshop, but I will say that like Twitter is the most media hub of the social media platforms. Twitter tends to be what reporters use the most because Twitter is focused on timeliness. Like breaking news shows up on Twitter almost instantly. You might not see it on Facebook till many hours or days later. So if you are on Twitter, that's like a really great way to start following your local news outlets and reporters. If someone has written something written something that you think is great, don't be shy to share it, to praise them for it. Like, great article by this reporter, like just to start to know who are your potential media allies, who has covered your issues in the past. Even if their coverage hasn't been exactly what you would hope it would be, if it's not the total opposite of what you want, then there may be a potential media ally of yours. The context everywhere. There's a lot of reasons that mainstream media is not where we would like it to be, but it is true basically universally that there have been humongous newsroom cuts almost across the board, basically globally. So it's often a quarter of the staff who were working 10, 15, 20 years ago who are expected to get just as many articles out every day. That's their real context. They are overworked, they are out of time, they're on deadlines that are frankly impossible to meet. This doesn't explain all of the pro-war coverage that we see. This isn't every problem that the media has, but this is a huge issue. And it basically means that if your story is hard for them to cover, it's probably not going to make the cut. They're probably not going to be able to cover it. The flip side is if you make things really easy for the reporters to cover, and we'll talk about how you do that, by giving them the material, by inviting them to come out well in advance, by making everything just clear and simple, providing them with the photos sometimes because they often can't send out a photographer to your event, that makes a huge amount of difference. And that often means that they can cover your story. I can't tell you how many protests or little rallies or things that events I've been to where people say, I can't believe the media isn't here to cover this. And then you ask the organizers, they never reached out to the media. The media can't just magically know what is happening and show up and cover it. You have to give them clear information and invitations to come and do it. That doesn't mean that they will 100% show up, but it's a really good start. So yeah, think about local context, start to build up that list of who you're hoping will cover your stuff and what are the different outlets doing. And I said local media, but if you live in a big city, for example, there will also be sort of, for example, there's Reuters, which is an international news wire. There's a Reuters reporter who I know is based in my city. So they're doing international media, but they're the local person writing. I would consider that part of my local media context. All right. So let's say you've done some of that, you've thought about sort of who is local media, you started to try to like track who's writing on issues you care about and who the people are. Now let's talk about you are planning something. Your chapter is holding an event. Maybe it's a Remembrance Day memorial. Maybe it is a Reclaiming Mother's Day event as an anti-war holiday event. Maybe it's a protest or a direct action. Maybe it's a peace music festival. Whatever it is, you are planning something and you want mainstream media coverage of your event. That's your goal. So if that's the context, then I'm going to talk through what are the steps that we found. I've only practiced this in a North American media context, but I understand from people elsewhere, it's not totally different in other places. So I think it's relevant. First things first, you have to develop your messaging. This sounds obvious, but if they're just going to write 2-3 sentences about your thing, what do you hope it will be? What is your framing? It's important to think of who is the messenger. We don't often name ourselves, but we are going to get named. So is it peace activists do so-and-so? Is it the local community comes together to denounce so-and-so? If you don't name who is the messenger, they will choose a name for you, and it may or may not be one that you like. Are you trying to put, for example, in Toronto, here's some of the actions that we've done. We've tried to put front and center the expat communities who come from war zones. So we've tried to have them be sort of the people telling the stories. With Yemeni community in Toronto denounces Canada's action. So then we're trying to put them as the messenger so that their story can sort of shine. That's something to think about. The next step, and I'll talk about steps 2 and 4 in a lot more detail in the next few slides. But yeah, you have to let media know to come to your event. So reporters that you have personal connections with, you can send a personalized email with, you can tag them on social media or on Twitter, you can phone certain outlets. But a good all-purpose tool is a media advisory. And I'll share some examples of what that can look like. It's concise, gives them the details they need, and it makes it appealing to them why they should actually send a reporter out to cover your event. Once they're there, your event is happening, and wow, a local reporter has actually showed up. Amazing. It's really important to greet them. I mean, to be polite, but also you want to know what outlet is this person from. Write it down, get their business card. Anyone who came to your event is like a major media ally of yours that you want the contact of for future reference. And afterwards, you want to be able to look up their coverage, to track down the TV news spot that aired or so forth. And it can be confusing to do that if you don't know exactly who covered your event. You also want to have someone who is specifically ready to speak to media at the event. I mean, it really depends what you're planning, but they'll probably want to get some footage or take some notes about what is just organically happening there. So they might film part of your speakers, or if it's a direct action, they'll film some of the protest or some of what's happening, but then they'll want to talk to someone. So I'll talk a bit more about getting ready to do that, but you really want to have someone who is prepared to give interviews. And it's separate from preparing the event. It's really a specific art into communicating what you want to communicate in just a few seconds to a TV camera. And then the final step, and we'll talk about this more a little bit, is whether or not media actually show up to your event, you want to create the coverage that you want to get. There's lots of different approaches to doing a press release. The approach that I'm going to show today, and that's worked really well for us, is really basically you pretending to be the media, like you creating a press release that acts as a standalone news article. So it doesn't seem like it was totally just written from your group. You're not misleading anything, but it's the type of press release that they can literally just take, print in their newspaper, and often they do. And they won't necessarily credit you for it, but then you've won, right? Because you've gotten exactly the coverage that you want printed in their newspaper. So you basically are doing the work of the media for them and getting that to them. There's a lot of pieces involved in doing that, and we'll talk about it. So basically the general steps are preparing ahead of time. What is the story that you want? Inviting media to come out, supporting them when they're there if they do show up, and whether or not they come, creating your own media and getting it to the outlets. Okay, moving along. So I wanted to give some examples of that part of inviting the media to come. The way I like to do that is with a media advisory that I send out a few days ahead. And then again, the morning of. This is an example of the advisory I know the writing might be small, you might not be able to really see it, but just to give a general sense, this is an example of the advisory we sent out last week ahead of a big protest that we had in Ottawa. It was North America's largest military and weapons fair, and we'd organized a big protest to greet the attendees. And so we really wanted media to come. So what we sent out ahead of time, it's the same format I use for all advisories. This first paragraph is actually a little long, but basically just a couple sentences at the beginning telling them what on earth this is. So here it says, hundreds are expected to protest the opening of North America's largest weapons and defense industry convention in Ottawa, where 12,000 attendees are gathering. So the what is a big protest at a big arms fair. So it's newsworthy. I gave one sentence on messaging. The protest will condemn war profiteering, highlighting that arms manufacturers have raked in record profits from the same conflicts around the world, which have brought misery to millions this year. So that's our like most core distilled version of our message. And then just to add a little bit of why this is newsy for them, I made it clear that the Canadian Defense Minister was going to be giving the keynote address basically at the same time as our protests, so that we were interfering with something that frankly media were probably already going to be covering inside the event. Then I always include a what, when, where, and some visuals, just so that they have all the info really handy, what time to show up, where they're going. You'll note I also included here to follow World Beyond War Canada's Twitter account for live updates during the rally. This only applies if you have someone who will be live tweeting, but it lets them know where they can sort of keep up to date on your protest as it's happening. And visuals, especially if you have something that will be good for TV cameras to film, it's good to tell them, and that encourages them to actually send a photographer, to actually send a videographer. So in this case, I knew, you should never misrepresent what's going to be there, but I knew that there would be a large crowd, and I knew that we had several 40-foot long banners, and I felt that they could certainly catch that on film. The other thing that I mentioned here is doing media calls. So the advisory we would send out to, I don't know, we might have 100, 200 media contacts in the Ottawa area. Some of them are specific reporters' emails, and some of them are just like the general news line for Ottawa Today, for Ottawa Daily, for whatever paper exists in this city. If it's in a smaller town, there's going to be fewer outlets. So the media advisory, we email to everyone. Media calls, I make the morning of, and I just make it to the type of news outlets that regularly send people out. So in a city, there's usually like a few TV channels that actually show up at local events and film it, or maybe one or two radio stations. And then I sent it to like that Reuters reporter, the Canadian Press reporter. They're kind of like the news wire, global news wires that will actually sometimes have a local person come out. So I usually am making maybe just 7, 8 calls, and that's in a big city. So just to the outlets that I think might legitimately send out a crew to cover an event. I'm not calling individual reporters personal numbers early in the morning. You don't want to wake them up. That's not nice. I'm calling really the news lines for papers. So their news tip line or whatever phone number they have publicly available on their website. And you're really just saying your one-line pitch. Hey, wanted to make sure you got the media advisory. It's going to be a big protest at North America's biggest arms fair this morning. Can you send a reporter, or are you going to send a crew? If they say they got the advisory, that's great. If they say they didn't, you just send it to them on the spot. In my experience, it makes a big difference. Sometimes they ask you questions. Sometimes they say, no, we're not going to send someone, but send us the release after and maybe we'll cover it. And sometimes they say, yeah, we're going to send a crew, and then you know, and you can be prepared for it. Any quick questions on the media advisory and calls before I move on? Yeah, go ahead, Al.
Do you personally know these reporters, and have you established a relationship with them?
I wouldn't say I personally know them. There's a bunch now that over the last nearly 2 years of working at World Beyond War that I have a bit of a relationship in. There's 1 or 2 files I've worked on that actually have gotten some mainstream Canadian coverage, specifically Canada's export of weapons to Saudi Arabia. That's been like one of the issues that mainstream media has been willing to be critical of. So now I pretty much know who are the 4 or 5 reporters in Canada who cover that. And if I'm going to be doing something related to that, I do now send them a personal email ahead. Like, hey, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're going to do this thing. And I'll email them even if it's a secret action that I'm not in, but telling other people to, because like there's sort of enough trust. I wouldn't say I sort of know them personally or have a personal relationship, but I know like these are the people who cover this issue. But it's taken me about 2 years. Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. This is really good stuff, and it explains, you know, why you get such good media, because of all the work that you do and the prep that you do and the carefulness of it. And I also want to add, I don't know if you've done this, but I sometimes also phone the reporters, not the reporters, the photographers line. There's the local paper publishes a photographers, you know, news line, and the photographers are, you know, working on the day, especially if it's on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday. And they will often just, you know, they seem to make their own some decisions about what they do, and that's been quite successful in the past. Even when I've sent the news release to the news desk, contacting the photographers who actually are often there might be a photographer and there's no reporter because the shortage of reporters. So I found that quite helpful, but it's also a lot of work to do when you're, you know, if you're the main organizer for an event, and you know, I sometimes find there's too much to do, and you know, I need to build my team better so that I can cover everything.
Yeah, that's a really good tip about the photographer line, and also a really good point. I think what I'm sharing here is kind of the full menu of things that I would do for a really serious thing that I'm planning. Not for every event, not for everything. And frankly, not every event that I do is a core goal, even to get media attention. Like often it's nice, but often the core goal is to bring the community together or to do something else. If it feels like a major goal is media coverage, and it's a big thing that I'm spending a ton of time planning with other people, then I prioritize doing every one of these things. But even doing 1 or 2 of these things is better than none. If you're trying to get media coverage, it's definitely not an all or nothing kind of situation. And you don't have to feel guilty if you don't pull out all the stops to get all the media for every event, because it's just not realistic. Go ahead, Greta.
Well, the other thing, Gretchen, I wonder is I find around here that the reporters change a lot. You know, sometimes they only stay for a year or 2, you know, some of the young reporters. And so, you know, you develop a relationship with one and then they're gone, and, you know, and it's quite frustrating sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in quickly to say, you know, that's why we're here on staff too. If this is feeling overwhelming, if you don't have enough people to help you, let us know. And we can certainly help with these various components. Like I am often helping Rachel, even though I'm not anywhere near her, you know, I'm 6 hours away, but I can do a lot of this work remotely. So don't hesitate to reach out to us for support. And then I was just going to say, if it also feels overwhelming that you don't know who the reporters are in your area, to start making those relationships, I would just say, like, start reading articles like from your local newspapers. And this applies to the op-eds that we're going to talk about later, but like start reading different outlets, and then you'll start seeing the same name. Oh, this reporter is always covering the peace and war issues. And then you'll start to know, you know, which outlets are more likely to show up to your events or which outlets are more likely to publish pieces. So just kind of start doing that research.
And I find I actually have to ask like certain friends and family members who I respect deeply, but to be honest, are not like as in these issues as I am, or don't have as radical politics as I am. They're actually like a much more helpful resource sometimes in terms of what are the mainstream media outlets that are relevant that most people are listening to. I think sometimes we can sort of self-select our own alternative media, which is wonderful, but then sometimes it's easy to lose touch of like what is actually the average person in my city or town reading or listening to. So to ask those people who are not in your group but want to support you to recommend sort of what are the TV shows that are sometimes critical of the government or sometimes raise alternative perspectives than the main talking points. Okay, so I'll move on here because we have not a lot of time. So I talked about, okay, media has come out to your event, or maybe they didn't come, but maybe they called you, they called the number in your media advisory, or they call you after, or generally, there's some way that they want to cover the thing that you've really been pushing. It can be easy to just think like, oh, the organizer will just speak to them. And they might do a good job of that, but it's, in my mind, a specific role to prepare for. And I spent a long time preparing for that protest in Ottawa, but I still gave myself a separate hour where I practiced with my partner, who was very patient, giving media interviews. And just like, it takes a lot to get that pitch, to get the main thing you want to say, to be concise, to be short, and to really represent what you want to say. So I recommend if there is a designated person who's going to be talking to media, A, try and have that person, and B, encourage them to practice. You want to start with the most important thing that you want them to cover. Sometimes we like to give like a ton of context and history and that. You don't know how long this interview might be. They might run off in 1 minute. So try to save that for later. Add that as background at the bottom of your press release, but really just say your main point. You almost are guaranteed that they're going to ask you some variation on what's going on here today. What is this? What's happening? And you so have that answer 100% prepared. So that's your chance, for example, with the arms fair, to say, we're here because the people most profiting off of war are here, and we're not going to let them get away with it. Or like just your one kind of quick response. Hundreds have come out today to say no to profiteering off of war. We won't let them continue to make billions off of selling weapons, whatever your one sentence is. Or we're reclaiming the history of Mother's Day. Mother's Day was founded as an anti-war holiday, and we're here today to live up to that legacy. Like just practice that one sentence that communicates what's going on. Practice it, practice saying a few other things. And just the more you've said these things, the more you'll feel comfortable actually saying them in front of a camera. Know how you want to be introduced, because they'll ask you who you are. You can't give a sentence. It's just a few words. So your name and what your title is. So your title might be with the blank chapter of World Beyond War, or an organizer of this event, or I'm a concerned citizen of blah, blah, blah town, like just whatever are the words that you want to follow your name. Do you have to answer all of a reporter's questions? The answer is always no. This is very easy if it's a print interview, like if you know they're recording you, but it's not live for anywhere, right? Like afterwards, they'll pick whatever answers they want to print. I think sometimes people feel like they have to answer every question. You do not have to answer every question. And if you say, I don't want to answer that, or I don't think that's relevant right now, or I'm not the best person to answer that, they're never going to print that. That's a boring answer. They'll just move on. If it's a live interview, so it's not just on film, but on live TV or on live radio, you obviously don't want to be rude. And you don't want to seem like you're avoiding their questions, but there's good tricks you can do. I tend to start, if there's a question that just feels kind of irrelevant, what I would tend to do is say, what I think isn't getting enough attention here is, and then you talk about one of your main points. Or you can say, I had a few others prepared, but I didn't write them down. Yeah, you can say, you know what I think is really interesting? and then speak to that. You can really pivot to what are your most important points. Don't let yourself get sidelined into a meaningless or irrelevant question.
Like politicians do all the time.
Yeah, and they're good
Yeah.
at it.
I would just really emphasize this point. Just always circle back to your main talking points, and always, like, if you are representing World Beyond War, like, always try to be bringing World Beyond War in, and like, what is the most important thing about World Beyond War's take on the issue, or World Beyond War is doing. Like, I recently did a podcast where, like, the interviewer was asking me like really complicated, like, geopolitical questions about like the state of the world, which I'm not necessarily even qualified to be like pondering about that. And so I was always just trying to like pivot back to, well, what World Beyond War does, or, this is a World Beyond War event coming up that's relevant or something. So just, yeah, be mindful of that. Like, you're always circling back, and it may seem slightly repetitive, but usually it's not really obvious to the listener that you're doing that.
Mm-hmm. And if they're really pressing you on something, you can always say, that's not my area of expertise. I'm here today because, and then tell them why you're here today. And I think people respect that. Okay. So now is the part that I mentioned in terms of giving the media story to media, whether or not they show up. You can just essentially make the media or your version of it and then get it to the outlets. And if it's compelling, places are likely to print it. They won't put your name as the author, probably. They might, but they might not. But that's fine. The goal isn't credit, right? The goal is to get your story into mainstream media and published there. So the basic format of a press release that we use is, you want to put for immediate release at the top. You want a pretty catchy headline. You want to have media contacts available. If you're putting a phone number or an email, whatever you're putting, that person has to be available that day, the hours after the protest, the hours after the press release is sent, to answer the phone, to answer those emails. They're often on a really tight deadline. If you don't get back to them within an hour after they called you, it's too late often. And it's just the nature of their schedule and what their deadline to get it into the paper for the next morning or that evening news or whatever. So be aware, whoever you put as the media contact should really be prepared to answer their phone, to have access to the info, the photos, whatever you've promised, and be able to get it to them. So there's kind of all that stuff at the top, and on the right here, I've sort of just given an example of what that actually looks like. And then the main important thing is the article. So the way we write a press release is to mimic the structure of a news article as closely as possible. So that means I'm actually going to pull up an example where we can scroll through it together and really look. So that means it should not read like the political manifesto of your chapter, or like the or like an op-ed even. It should read like a news article. Here, let me pull up the one from our protest last week. Okay, can you folks all see this? Okay, so this is how it went out during our protest. In this case, we really wanted it to be treated as breaking news, and we knew we were gonna be there for 3-4 hours, so we wanted to send it out early so reporters could then actually show up after getting it. So we did make sure to send it like while the action was still happening. But in any case, this is what went out and what people got. We had written this headline ahead of time: hundreds protest, block entrances to North America's largest weapons fair, but we didn't send it out as such until that actually happened. You never want to lie or mislead or misrepresent what you did for a bunch of reasons. But also they'll never trust you again if you do that. So it doesn't really serve you well. We included a photo. We later got lots of, in some cases, stronger photos, but to have a photo from what's happening, if possible, is great. There's 2 different photos. So one sort of showing the general protest and another showing a specific area that was blocked with a banner. In this case, we were getting photographers to add photos to a folder. And so we just made that link available in the press release. There's lots of ways to do this. You can also just say additional photos available upon request, and then outlets know they can email you to get the photos. But most
Rachel,
importantly,
you need to put captions on those additional photographs.
sorry, what's the question?
Did those photographs that you're sharing to the media, are captions needed for them?
If it's not clear what's happening, it's good to have captions, or in this case, we made sure the file names included the photographer's name so that they would be credited as the photographer. Like, we did recruit a specific, I'll talk about this a bit after, but we did recruit a specific photographer to come and photograph our action. So then we wanted the very least that they be credited for the photos they took. So we made sure those were in the titles. But in terms of the text of the press release, we use this basic format basically every time. The first sentence or two is just what is happening. This should be like news media objective, like as in it shouldn't be your analysis of it. It should just be like what is happening on the ground. Obviously portray it the way you want to, but it should read the way any newspaper article would read. So here we put hundreds of people have blocked access. Their 40-foot banners said the following: driveways were obstructed immediately before the defense minister was going to give the keynote address. So something basic to set the scene. Then your actual messaging that you want them to hear, that goes in a quote. If you just write, these war profiteers are doing blah, 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 that doesn't sound newsy. They can't print that as a news article, right? That's like a letter to the editor or an op-ed. But if you put it as a quote, then of course they can print it because that's what someone said. So the main things that we wanted to get across, which is that these are the companies that are raking in billions off of these wars. They have blood on their hands. They're perpetrating conflict. That we put in a quote right at the top. And I also, this is a bit of a long quote, but it doesn't matter. We also had a line here: we're disrupting CANSEC in solidarity with the millions of people around the world who are being killed, who are suffering. So again, kind of pivot the focus from their fancy corporate convention to the real victims of war. So that you can do sort of with a quote. Anything that you think they'll think, oh, is that really true? If you've used a number, you can include a link. Usually you don't use footnotes in a press release. You could, but if it's something that you can link to a different objective source, you can include a link. And then you want to add more context. They're probably not going to include tons and tons about your protest. They'll probably, or your event, they'll probably use that as the entryway into discussing the broader issue. So here we included more context about Lockheed Martin. What were their profits this year? About Raytheon, about some of the major people who were inside. And again, this is not us opining about how terrible they are. It's us concretely showing these are the numbers on their profits. This is what their CEO said about how they're benefiting from this war. So it's all stuff that news media can just go ahead and print. We have more quotes from more people. And then you start to add more and more context that's slightly further removed. We start talking here about Canadian weapons exports. We have more quotes. We included a few more photos. It doesn't have to be this long, but in this case, we had a lot to say. And eventually we gave more context on the weapon fair itself. Not our key talking points, but we mentioned they have 12,000 attendees coming. There are 300 exhibitors, etc. Just the type of context that often might be at the bottom of a news article. And here a bunch more photos. We don't always include it, but in this case we did add a bit of background info that they could choose to use or not use, highlighting that in the city where this arms fair happened, which is the capital city, there's hundreds of lobbyists working for these weapons industries. What do they do, etc., etc. We shared some stuff about the last 20 years of protests against this arms fair. Up to you if you want to include extra context. So that's sort of an example of a press release. And then I thought I would just show the same, just so you see how it looks. This is how the advisories, so this went out a few days before, looked for the same event. So instead of the whole article, it's just the sort of 2 sentences of context right at the beginning, the details of what, when, where, visuals, and then we did include some background points. This is optional, but sort of to let them know how they could frame this article if they were going to pitch it to their editor or to whoever. And a lot of these background points we later included in the release. So those are just sort of an example of an advisory and a release. We can also send these out so you have them. I would say the most important thing to keep in mind with a release is to write it like a news article. Write it so that they don't have to edit it and they can just print it. I think that's what has given us so much success in getting our stuff printed. We've just made it so easy for them. Yes, go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you clarified the difference between media advisory and a press release. So basically, the press release is what you send out on the day after the action's been done, and the media advisory is beforehand and a lot shorter.
Yeah, that's the way we do it. Yeah, sometimes people use the same words to mean different things, but for me, an advisory is an invitation to the media to come or to know this thing is going to happen. And the release is when the event is happening as soon as possible, ideally, either during it's happening or like maybe an hour or two after. It depends. If it's like a breaking news thing, then you want to get it to them really quick. If it's something more like a concert or an event, it's okay to send it probably a few hours after, but it's the actual report of the event. So you prepare it ahead of time. Like we write a draft ahead of time, but you don't finalize all the details in it until you actually did the thing and you know that it's true. You might think your event is 100% predictable, but like, you never know. The power might cut out midway through if it's a concert, or something might happen, and you want to make sure that's what you send out is the truth about how your event actually was.
And
Yeah.
what about live streaming, Rachel? Are you covering that today also?
I'm going to mention it briefly, but yeah.
Thanks.
So this is that leads perfectly into my next slide. So the other aspect of making your own media, besides like writing the press release and then sending it out to media, is doing your own sort of social media coverage, and getting your own photos of your event. Sometimes a photojournalist comes to your event and takes great photos, and that's great, but we know we can't count on that, and they might not even make the photos available to you. And you might have 50 people at your event with their phone out all taking photos, but in my experience, there's also no guarantee that you'll actually get any of those photos or that you'll get them quickly. So I 100% of the time have a designated person who I know is my photo taker at that event. I know this isn't always possible. Ideally, it's a photographer or at least someone with extensive experience. Yes, any of us can snap a photo with our phone, but it is harder than you think to take a good photo at a protest or a good photo at certain types of events. And if it's a type of action where they need to be ready quick and where there's like chaos, such as, for example, these photos here of people lying down on a banner. These were very hard photos to get. They had to kind of dodge around the police and then take them very quickly. If it had not been a skilled photographer, we would not have gotten those photos, guaranteed. It was also pouring rain, which you can't tell here. All these things that make it quite a bit harder to actually get the photos you want. So I always have a designated person. And if I know that I want the press release to go out during the event, then I have a conversation ahead of time with the photographer about how I want them to not just do what they probably normally do, which is take a whole bunch of photos on their camera, then go home, then edit them, then send it to me later that night. How I want them to be ready to send me a few, or better yet, send the person who's going to email the press release a few right away. So for some, they already know how to do that. Their fancy camera is connected to their phone and they can just do it. Others, they'll need to make a little plan like, okay, right after the event, I'm going to go to my car and I'm going to plug it into my laptop that's waiting there, but whatever it is, they need to think through that plan ahead of time. Otherwise, it's going to be maybe 2, 3, 4 hours before you get any of those photos. So if time is of the essence, you really have to plan out with the photographer how you'll get the photos right away.
Rachel, on the press release, you said something about high resolution photos available upon request. Does that mean you're not doing that with your phone? It means you need a camera?
Ideally, yes. Some phones can take better photos. What it mostly means is that the one that gets sent in that mass email, regardless of whether the initial photo was on an amazing camera, email, just the nature of sending things out on a mass email, is going to compress the photo to a very small size, which may not matter in some cases, but may matter for some outlets. So it means you're kind of telling them like, look, here's just a quick snapshot of the photo, but to get like the full file, we can make that available to you. And so you have someone who's prepared to send it, or who's separately uploading it. Phone quality just really depends. But the average photo snapped quickly on a phone, yeah, no, is not high resolution. And again, how much it matters, it sort of depends. But anyways, in terms of social media, I will just say it's another one of those things that looks like it's super easy to do. But if any of you have tried to live tweet an event or post live from something happening, it's surprisingly tricky. You're like, oh, what's the name of that speaker or this or that? If there's a few things that you know you want to get out right away and you want people to be sharing them, it's better to actually draft those messages ahead of time. So here, for example, on the right side here is a tweet that we sent out. It's now been shared, I think, over 700 times. It really did spread. I wrote this message the night before and then made sure it was true in the moment. And then all that had to happen there was Greta, who was ready in another city, plugged in some of the photos she got and posted it. She didn't have to think on the spot, what's the best thing to say. I will also just say that, like, yes, our social media that we're posting and mainstream media are separate things, but they really interconnect. We have seen mainstream media either share what we're posting online or include quotes from what we post on social media in their coverage, or in some cases decide, for example, we got really great Democracy Now! Video coverage last year with an event that we did. They only found out about it because they had seen it on Twitter. So sometimes you get the mainstream media coverage from your social media, or sometimes you get great mainstream media coverage and then you share it on social media. So these things can sort of work together to amplify it. People, you can overthink hashtags, and it's a whole separate topic. In this case, though, we really wanted to use the official hashtag for the event because we totally took it over. The CanTech 2022 is their official hashtag for their huge weapons fair, but all the top social media is from our protest, which is really fun, and from all of our allies. So you have all the weapons companies who are busy being like, come to booth 232 to see our new drones, and all that was drowned out by our coverage. So that was a really fun way that we could take over their hashtags where they were trying to promote their fair on the day. Yep, go ahead, Liz, and then I'm going to try and quickly wrap up because it's I want Greta to have a chance to talk about her pieces.
Yeah, just a quick a detailed question, Rachel. So you said Greta posted the tweet and the photographs. So how did Greta get the photographs on the time?
Yeah, so I had connected her ahead of time with the photographer by we use Signal, which is a secure type of text messaging, especially for actions where you really want to make sure the police don't know what you're planning ahead of time. It's good to like be aware what channels you're using to plan it. That's a whole separate conversation. But in any case, I had connected them ahead of time by message so that on the spot she could be texting with them, and they already knew how they were going to send the photos to her. So they knew this is the person I'm sending photos to. She's going to be waiting to see my photos. Again, this is more crucial for sort of like a breaking news, direct action kind of thing, possibly like probably less crucial for an event where you are okay to wait sort of an hour or two after the event to get your media out. But yeah, you want to think through all of that ahead of time, basically.
The
I also
photographer sort of choose and edit the photos on the spot to send to Greta then.
choose yes, but not edit. And you need to be clear with them. They may love to edit their photos, that they can do that for all the rest of their photos after, but that we're asking for 2, 3, 4 on the spot, not edited, just from the action. And often they can just spend 5 minutes on their camera, pick a few that look like they're probably okay, and then send it. They won't be the best photos. Like eventually later, the ones you get from them 3, 4 hours later will be better. And you can still share those and you can still send them out. But if the goal is to get quick media, and this did work, a whole bunch of media outlets who didn't show up for the beginning of the protest got our press release and then did show up for the end. So in this case, it really worked to get it out fast, and speed was more important. In terms of social media from an action, there's like an event, there's like a whole, we have given other workshops on this and we can share those as well. We have done one on how to live stream your event, for example. But those can also be things that can get attention to what you're doing, and are worth pursuing. Here is where I put sort of the role that Greta has played with me for a bunch of these actions. What are kind of her steps to make sure she has lined up? This is where you do have someone who is just calmly sitting at their computer, ready to support your media, who is not at the event with you. It's just way too chaotic if they're also trying to be there. But if they're just calmly at home, this is kind of their to-do list so they can be ready to get media out during your event. This is a great thing to do if you have a chapter member who's like moved further away or can't come but wants to help. So the first thing is you need to have the list ready, obviously, of who you're sending the press release to. You don't want to be fishing through 25 different emails or documents to find it, like to have that all ready to go. This is probably the same email list you sent your media advisory to. You want to have the draft press release ready to go. And you can leave some blanks, like blank number of people came out to do blank or to do this and this and this, and then you fill it in on the day of. You want them to be in touch with people who are actually at the event so they can get those quick updates. So think ahead about how you want to communicate with that person. With Greta and I, like we'll text message from the event, and I'll send semi-incoherent quick updates like tons of cops, or we're getting delayed, it's going to be half hour late, or whatever it is, just so she knows where things are at. Yeah, and as I mentioned, she's ready to put photos from the photographer into the press release right away, and to post on social media, or post up on the World Beyond War website. This is all stuff also that we're very happy to help you with offsite, because this is part of our job. Yeah, go ahead, Al.
Question regarding the list of media contacts and the actual release itself. Do you let all the media contacts see who's getting this release? If it's 30 different media contacts, or do you blind copy them so it looks like they're getting it, but they don't know who else is getting it?
Yeah, that's a great question. We send it out through Action Network. So it's like the same way you would get a newsletter from World Beyond War, so you don't see who else is getting it. We would never sort of pretend that we're sending it exclusively to them. But yeah, it's not nice to have a huge list of emails. I feel like it opens people up to spam. So if you are just sending it to maybe like 10, 15 local outlets, I would blind copy. I think that's a good strategy. The only time I would really make it seem like I'm sending it out specifically to one person or two is if I am. So there have been some actions where don't tell anyone ahead of time, it's going to be a secret. When we did block weapons trucks, for example, like that action was not going to work if anyone knew that we were going to show up at that trucking facility. So the only people we told ahead of time were 3 or 4 reporters who we knew covered this issue. And then I was very clear in the email that I'm sending this to you in confidence. It's not to be published, but so that you know that in 2 days, we're going to do this thing. I'm sending this to you because of my respect for your work on this thing. And so they understood that it was A, confidential, and B, sort of exclusively being sent to them. The other times I've done that when it hasn't been breaking news is if you really have access to information that nobody else has. For example, I was once in a situation where my group was, this is separate from World Beyond War, was infiltrated by police. And we felt like we had a really compelling story once we discovered that we'd been infiltrated. We didn't send out a big press release. We reached out to a few reporters and said, like, we've got an exclusive tip on something. Are you interested in covering this? We're just reaching out to you. Yeah, that might be more than the question that you were asking, but I would never make it seem like you're only sending it to one reporter if you're actually sending it to lots. And then finally, whoops, this is the wrong way. Yeah, no, I think that's it for now on this. And again, I know this is kind of overwhelming, but any aspect of doing this is better than no aspects of doing it. If all you have the capacity to do is to plan out some social media posts for your action or for your event, then do that. If all you have capacity to do is reach out to a few reporters ahead of time, reach out to some radio stations asking them if they'll let their listeners know about your event, then that's a great place to start. So start where you can and then try to build up your capacity on that. And now I'll pass it to you, Greta.
Thanks. Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of time left, so I will try to kind of be brief with this, and we can provide one-on-one support afterwards if needed. So the remainder of the presentation is thinking more about op-eds and letters to the editor, both of which are more of commentary pieces, more of an opinion piece, whereas Rachel was really making that distinction of the press release being written in a very newsy, objective way with then quotes interspersed that provided those opinions, whereas the letter to the editor and the op-ed are pretty much all your opinion, and then you are including some facts to back it up. So these are some general writing tips, and this could also kind of apply to various other contexts as well. But essentially, you want to be concise and compelling. You want to find, what is the hook? What makes this interesting and relevant to be submitting a letter to the editor or an op-ed about? It could be connected to current news, for example, right, with the crisis in Ukraine. That was like a hook that we could use to then write various op-ed pieces talking about this crisis and then connecting back to why World Beyond War's work is so important, why we need the abolition of war. Or, it could be like a different special holiday or day, like Hiroshima Day or International Day of Peace could be coming up, and using that kind of timely event as a hook to then come back to your anti-war talking points. So something compelling, something newsy, the hook that brings people in. And being concise, being succinct. I think that, there's a tendency when people are maybe writing an op-ed for the first time to kind of go on a rant. We want to avoid ranty pieces, and this is not like writing an email to your friend or something. You're thinking about a professional piece that is forward facing in a reputable news outlet. So it has a bit of a formal tone. It is not angry at the world, even though the issues that we're talking about are really challenging issues and we really hate the situation. We have to be a bit objective and professional in the way that we write these pieces. To that point, we want to provide references, which often is a hyperlink, as you'll see in some examples. Usually we just hyperlink, as Rachel did in the press release too, just hyperlinking to different objective media sources that can back up our opinions. We never want to exaggerate, echoing Rachel's point earlier. Again, don't want to be ranting, don't want to be exaggerating. We do want to try to have kind of mind-blowing statistics when we can that are headline grabbing and shocking. So thinking about ways that you can write your piece in a way that is compelling, that is drawing people's attention, but without exaggerating or lying. And then the tone of the piece also, I said in general, professional, a bit formal, but also that tone will be dictated by the particular outlet that you are submitting your piece to. So often when I'm going to write an op-ed or letter to the editor, I'm going to do some initial research and I'm going to read different pieces that have been published in that outlet first and get a sense of what is the tone, what is the style, for example, magazines or newspapers are very witty and trying to write in kind of almost a humorous, witty way. Others might be completely different. So just thinking about what is the tone and trying to kind of match it with the outlet that you're submitting to. Making it personal is also important in the sense of that could be taken in two different ways. One, like personal in a sense of like, why are you a spokesperson for the issue? Like, why are you writing about this issue? What gives you credibility to write about the issue? And that could be, I'm a chapter coordinator for World Beyond War, or for Yuri, right? Yuri's been doing amazing work speaking to Democracy Now! And he's talking about his personal experience living in Kyiv and why he's a spokesperson for that issue. So kind of connecting it to, give yourself credibility. For example, for the recent op-ed that I had published in Common Dreams, I was talking about kind of my commentary on the world, my commentary on activism and different approaches to activism. And I talked about the fact that I am an activist and that I work for World Beyond War and that I also work on the farm, and that I connected those two issues in my piece. So explaining why I'm writing about it. The other way that you can make it personal is by sharing a personal story that is compelling. For example, Cynthia Lazaroff, some of you may know, is kind of a well-known anti-nuclear activist. She sort of has famously shared her personal story of the incident in Hawaii where there was the false missile alert, where everyone in Hawaii got the text message saying that a missile was going to hit Hawaii in 7 minutes and they thought the world was ending. And that was like, really, really crazy experience. And because of that experience, she's now kind of become the spokesperson for why we need to get rid of nukes. So that's another way, like if you have a really sort of touching, emotionally like heart-wrenching story, you could put that in there. For local publications that are hyper local, like specific to a particular town, thinking about if there's a particular angle that makes it relevant to that outlet. And one way, for example, to do that is talking about military spending. And the National Priorities Project, if you look that up, they have a trade-offs calculator where you can enter your location. This is only in the US, unfortunately, but you can enter your location and then it will tell you like how much taxpayers are paying in that location for the military. And then the trade-offs calculator says how that money could be spent on teachers and solar panels and all these other things. So like, that's a really cool thing that you can put. Like I had a piece published in a newspaper in Virginia, and I used that statistic. I was like, taxpayers in Virginia are paying $4,000 roughly on average, per year on the military. In Virginia, we have, XYZ problem, that much money could go towards this issue. So that's one way to make it local, is like how much we're spending and how that could like what we could actually tangibly see locally with that money. Another thing is to try to refer to World Beyond War, try to mention World Beyond War, and not in like a false, fake way, but, if you can kind of link to, an article or a campaign or a petition or something that we're doing on the issue that you're writing about, that helps to kind of publicize us. So for example, in my recent piece with Common Dreams, again, I was kind of analyzing and providing commentary on the state of the world and activism and effective strategies of activism. And at the end, I talked about our conference, which was kind of a sneaky way to kind of get World Beyond War in there and say, hey, come to our conference, which talks about all these issues. And then, Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I can just add, it's like it helps to promote us, which is great. But also, if your article has touched people, it also gives them something they can do. If all it is your name and your amazing points, I mean, they can share that article with their friend, but they don't have any sort of next steps. But if you've mentioned an organization, then they think, oh, I'm going to look that up. Maybe there's more. So it also gives people a way to act on what you're saying.
And then another important point here is the last one, to submit your piece to only one publication at a time. That's kind of usually the standard. So outlets usually don't want to be republishing like content that has already been published elsewhere. They want original exclusive content. So for example, first I got my piece published by Common Dreams. Then after Common Dreams published it, we republished it on World Beyond War's site with a link back to the Common Dreams site. So that's kind of the best standard to submit it to a piece exclusively. Often you have to submit it to many, many different outlets in order to get it published. The Common Dreams was sort of the opposite of that. In that case, they just published it right away, but usually that's not the case. Like for example, with the Virginia newspaper article I was talking about, I submitted it to a dozen different outlets before one of them finally picked it up. So what I do is I start with the one that I think is the most, possible potentially that will publish it, email it to them. I usually wait. It depends. Some people wait 3 to 5 days, some people wait a week or something. Sometimes the outlet will tell you outright on their webpage how long to wait. Like they will say, if you don't hear back from us within 1 week, like go ahead and submit it elsewhere. Sometimes they'll give you that time frame. So I usually just wait as a courtesy if I don't hear back from them. Occasionally I'll do a second email. Like if I really, really want to get it into that particular outlet, like with Common Dreams, I just send them a little reminder. Hey, did you see this? And they're like, oh yeah, sorry. And they published it. So sometimes I do a second follow-up. So yeah, I'm just kind of like working steadily through my list, like submit it to one, wait, didn't hear back, submit it to the other, wait, didn't hear back, and just keep going until I get one picked up. And then you just have to also kind of communicate with them. Like I always ask them, once they publish it, okay, is it okay for me to republish it on World Beyond War's website? And often they'll say yes, as long as you give the attribution, if you link back to the original. In some cases, it's only exclusive and they'll say, no, you cannot republish it anywhere else. So just check in with them to make sure you know the standards.
Just a quick point of clarification. So in case this wasn't clear, this is the exact opposite of what we were saying before with press releases. And that's because press releases is like a media understood tool. They understand you are blasting out your press release to the press, that however many outlets may have gotten it, and that you don't necessarily, that you're not asking to be listed as, I am the author, I am the person who wrote this article. This is a completely different approach. And we have to treat it really differently. And that's why here you do want to be personal. You do want to be, you're not trying to just be sort of the staff news reporter of the day's news. You're actually presenting a perspective. They're going to list you as the author, and they don't want it published in 5 other places. It's just for their outlet. So it's just a completely different approach. And if it is a press release, it should always be labeled press release, because then they'll understand what they're getting. On their end, there's no confusion about press releases versus you pitching an article to them.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Next. Okay, so briefly, letters to the editor and op-eds. Letters to the editor essentially are much, much shorter. They're often 200 words or fewer, but again, you should research the outlet that you're publishing to and check whatever their guidelines are. And the difference where a letter to the editor versus an op-ed, the letter to the editor is responding to a recent news article that was published in that specific piece. So it's basically like the readers of the newspaper's commentary on articles that have been published by that same newspaper. So it often, it says, Dear Editor, and then it often starts with like, the August 17th news article titled blah, blah, blah about, the Ukraine crisis, and then you're giving commentary on that, whether you agree with it and add some more points to it, whether you disagree and say, what that author missed or what that author didn't point out, I would like to add to it or whatever. So it's a commentary on something that has been published in that newspaper. You often have like an ask, a policy ask, not always, but often have a policy ask of what what was the outcome that you want on the issue. And we'll look at an example in a second. Again, like the op-ed as well, it's this mix of facts and opinion. So it is good to back up what you're saying if you can link to 1 or 2 other sources to provide some references. You don't want to overwhelm people and just have, data points throughout the whole thing, but just a few things to kind of strengthen your point. And again, if you can kind of bring in your personal approach as well, your personal connection, why are you a spokesperson for this? And it could be simply like, as a New Yorker, this matters to me, or like because you're writing to a local newspaper probably. So kind of tying in as a resident of this region, blah, 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 or whatever the personal connection is. Okay, we can move to the next. So this is from Al. Congratulations, Al, Central Florida chapter coordinator here on the call. Al got this published in the local newspaper in Florida. And this is a letter to the editor about the crisis in Ukraine. And you can we don't have time to read through this word for word, but I wanted to kind of give you just this aesthetic to show you kind of what a letter to the editor, LTE, looks like. So this is about 250 words. So very short commentary. And Al is responding to a recent newspaper article about the crisis in Ukraine, which is, of course, being talked about nonstop in mainstream media. He is providing some kind of facts and statistics in terms of like referencing what various U.S. ambassadors and various elected officials have said on the crisis, also referencing some quotes and information from weapons manufacturers and how weapons manufacturers are talking about profiting from the Ukraine crisis. So he's giving some of that kind of context and facts, and then pivoting to his opinion on the crisis, which was not being told in the mainstream article that he's responding to, and talking about towards the bottom there, we're told that we have no choice other than war, and concluding with his policy ask of a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, an end to the sanctions, reparations payments, and assurances of security for Ukraine, Crimea, Donbass, and Russia. So hopefully that gives you just very briefly a little bit of a sense of what a letter to the editor can look like. Okay.
Just one quick thing I want to say. This is an example where you can sort of cheat a little bit in terms of the suggestion that was made at the very beginning of the call, which is, hey, can we share letters to the editor that we've written and get them published in other papers? If it's something like this, you can kind of cheat the needing to respond to a specific article. You can be guaranteed any newspaper in the world is including coverage about this conflict. And so this is one case where we actually can just make tiny little tweaks to letters to the editor that other World Beyond War chapter members have written and send them to our local paper. And it doesn't always have to reference a recent article, because there might be 50 recent articles that are relevant. So when it's something that's such a big news story that every paper is talking about it, I think we can do some of that time-saving stuff that was suggested at the beginning, which is like, let's share these talking points and let's just like mass send out our letters to the editor.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, Al and I worked on sending this out to the Florida list of people in Florida who are on World Beyond War's list, and telling them, basically you can use this and just tweak it a little, do make it personal a little bit, but this can be like a template. And yeah, as Rachel said, it's not actually like referencing a specific article on a specific day, because there's tons of articles being published on Ukraine right now. So thanks for pointing that out. And we will move to the next one. Okay, so op-eds, which are basically opinion pieces. These are longer pieces. Historically, op-ed comes from the term that it's opposite the editorial page. That's sort of outdated now because people don't often read hard copy newspapers. The New York Times, which is like one of the first newspapers, if not the first to use the term op-ed, has now kind of shifted to calling them guest essays. And that's basically what it is. It's, a member of the public, a guest, not someone on staff of the newspaper, who is submitting an opinion piece to the newspaper. And these are just some screenshots of some op-eds that I've had published over the years working for World Beyond War. We have the Progressive magazine is a great one that has published a few of our pieces. That's a great ally. Common Dreams has also published several pieces from us. Another really great ally, LA Progressive in the top right. Let's move on. So op-ed significantly longer than letters to the editor. Roughly, this is very rough, 600 to 1,200 words, but it really depends on the outlet. So again, you're going to want to do that research and figure out what is the word limit that that particular outlet is looking for. As you're kind of researching the outlet, you're also researching if they have any specific submission requirements. Some outlets are very, very anal about this and say, like, you must send it as a Word document, or you must send it and does this or that, and you must include this information. Some of them want you to send a photo of yourself and a little bio that's often included like at the bottom of the article. So it's really good just to double check, because you don't want your piece like thrown out just because you didn't do the exact like formatting requirements that they wanted. And often outlets will be wary of attachments because of viruses. So they will often say, like, if you do send an attachment, also please copy and paste it into the body of the email. So I always just do that kind of as a default, to just put it in the body of the email as well. Again, as we kind of talked about through this whole training, researching various outlets that align with your messaging. Often the topics that we're writing about are not topics that the mainstream media will cover. And so I'm usually researching outlets, like Common Dreams, Truth Out, Truth Dig, The Progressive, Counterpunch, more alternative kind of progressive outlets that are more likely to publish this kind of thing, because I don't want to waste my time. It is very challenging. There's a lot of competition to get anything published. So I'm, going to research and then choose, the top ones that I think are most likely to publish the piece. Each outlet is unique. So just so that you know that when you're kind of going into this, like the relationship with the editor is going to be different in each case. Like some of the editors really just kind of, publish the piece as is, and thanks so much. We published it. That's it. Other ones work with you a lot and like have worked with me back and forth to like provide edits and significantly like work with me to change the piece. And of course, like all of that is with my, consent, because it's going to have my name on it. They're not just going to change it and publish it without you consenting. But just so that there's kind of that range of hands-on to hands-off editing approaches depending on the outlet. And you don't necessarily know that going in, but just be aware that that might happen. And then ghostwriting is another thing to consider. So when I've struggled to get a piece published, one thing to consider is ghostwriting, which means that I wrote it, but then I reached out to someone who has a bigger, well-known name than me, maybe a celebrity, maybe someone who is well-known in the particular topic area, maybe someone who is well-known locally. If you're doing this to, submitting to a hyper-local outlet, maybe like a leader in the faith community in your town or some other kind of well-known leader that has some clout in your region, reaching out to them and saying, here's a piece that I wrote, like, would you be interested in collaborating with me? And like putting your name on it, and the outlet may be more willing to publish it that way.
That is, by the way, the only way that I have had op-eds published in mainstream Canadian media that are critical of war is by getting like a former member of parliament to be the person on it, or someone kind of like a slightly less very famous version of Naomi Klein did one for us. Like that is the only way that I have gotten op-eds in mainstream media. They just won't publish random person they've never heard of. Your local media might have a different story, but like I wouldn't take it personally. Like sometimes they just, if it's not going to be one of the reporters writing it, sometimes they only want like a famous person's name on it.
All right. Oh, syndication. Yeah. And we're just about out of time. So I think I will end here to say that syndication is an option. And I think, John, you might have had success with this. Peace Voice is one of the great outlets that does it. So basically, it's like you submit the piece to Peace Voice, and then they submit it to all of their journalist contacts. In this case, it's nationwide in the US. And then their list, the people that are on their list can pick it up if they want. So for example, like when I had a piece that Peace Voice, published my op-ed, and they distributed it to their list. And then I want to say like a dozen different outlets picked it up. And these are more like local outlets, like, LA Progressive was one of the examples we had on the previous slide. So these are more localized or regional outlets that pick up the piece. So basically, it sounds a little bit weird, but the same exact piece is getting published in multiple outlets simultaneously across the country. And that's what syndication is. And so in that way, you can reach, like millions of people, which is pretty incredible. Al is asking about a word limit. Yes, so Peace Voice does have pretty specific recommendations. If you go to their website, peacevoice.info, they have a tab on the site that says for writers. Just check that tab and they explain the kind of pieces that they're looking for, the word limits, all of that. And in the case of Peace Voice, each syndication outlet is going to be different. But in this case, they're looking for pieces that are about peace and anti-war issues, but they're also looking for pieces that are not radically to one extreme, because they are syndicating it nationwide. They want something that kind of any old mom and pop newspaper around the country would pick up. So it was interesting to write that way. Like I didn't like water down my talking points, but I tried to think like kind of how to present the message to a more mainstream audience. But anyway, they explain all of that on their website of what they're looking for. So I think I will stop there. We're out of time and we can just open up to any final Q&A and discussion.
I know I already spoke a lot, but I realized one thing that I really forgot to say that is so important and that also always gets forgotten with media stuff, which is afterwards, thank the reporters who covered your event. We may think that they don't care, but their job is actually quite thankless. Always thank them, whether that's like responding to their email or however they got in touch with you or texting them back. Ideally, give a public thank you on social media. I wouldn't make it seem like, thank you for being the only anti-war reporter, blah, 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 because then that makes them seem like they're not objective. But just to say like, blank for their excellent coverage and share their news article, it makes a huge difference. And that makes them want to keep working with you. Don't go on a public rant about their coverage if they came out to your event. Like it's really easy to do that, or you don't love the coverage that you got, but like don't burn those bridges. There's so few outlets. If they came out to your event, they'll probably come out again. Their coverage might improve. Like don't be kind. And the other thing is, you might think you got no coverage, but did you actually look? I've had so many people say like, oh, I don't know if anyone covered our event. The only reason I find the coverage of our protests is by doing a Google News search afterwards. So a day, 2 days after, 3 days after, keep searching, use some keywords. You can set Google News to only search things that came out within the last 24 hours, for example. So if I just searched CanSec, which was the name of the arms fair, results from the last 24 hours, that was how I found a bunch of outlets covering our protest that I had no clue. First of all, I didn't even know they had sent a reporter in person because the person didn't identify themselves, didn't have a camera, but turns out was taking notes. And it sounds obvious, but often people miss the coverage that they got because they don't search for it after. So it's really important to do. And I should also add, I gave the example of this protest from last week in terms of the materials that we put. And then in terms of what the end result was, we got the full mixed bag of coverage, some really amazing stuff. Some reporters who showed up in person and did a great job. Some reporters who showed up in person and frankly didn't do a great job, but it was on the evening news and that was something. We got radio, we got some French language media, which in Canada is equally important as English language media, but can be harder to get in some ways. So we got the mixed bag, so our strategies did work, but also I try not to sort of beat myself up about the coverage that we got, that it's like, oh my God, they just made us seem like we were a ridiculous bunch of people in the rain at 7 a.m. Like that's sometimes how it goes, and you can't ultimately control all the coverage that you get. So yeah, but we only found it because we searched on Google afterwards.
Going back to the point that Al raised in his introduction, and you kind of touched on it about how, for example, certain publications, you can only submit to them and no other, and that sort of thing. So what do you think about this idea about having an archive of letters to the editor and op-ed pieces, perhaps, sort of the Mother's Day ones, the Memorial Day ones, the Independence Day ones, or the International Day of Peace ones? What do you think about having sort of them there, if not the full-blown, some sort of skeleton that we can kind of cut and paste and use some ideas in order to kind of ease the ease the work for all of us as we go through the year?
I think it's brilliant, and it would be pretty easy to pull off. And I mean, it sounds like it sort of started a little bit with sharing Al's with the Florida chapters, but we could very easily expand that to making Al's into a little bit of a template and then sending it out to all the chapters right now. Hey, send this to your local paper to comment on the war in Ukraine. And then, like you said, to have ones that are for specific occasions where we know the newspapers are going to need to print something for Memorial Day, for Mother's Day, for blah, blah, blah. I think that's super doable. What do you think, Greta?
Yeah, I think we don't have exactly what you're suggesting, John, which we would need to work on, but we have a few things that are almost there that could be helpful. So I put one link in the chat, which is like our webpage. I see some people have to go. It's okay, guys. We are going to send out the recording afterwards. So thanks for joining us. But so I put just the link in the chat for our op-ed and letter to the editor page, which has some examples that might be helpful for you. It links to various past examples, and it also links to various talking points, general sort of war abolition talking points and sort of sub talking points. So that might be helpful. Also, just our website itself is an archive of all of the best sort of World Beyond War related op-eds and letters to the editor and articles over the years. So if you go to just WorldBeyondWar.org and use the little like magnifying glass search tool in the top left corner and search for different topics, you will probably see a result for whatever, Mother's Day or whatever it is you're looking for. So whenever like a World Beyond War staff or chapter member or ally like get something published, we try to republish on it on our site. So our site does kind of become a bit of an archive. So I would recommend checking there. And if you still can't find it, then just get in touch with us and we can try to direct you to it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. I appreciate it, Rachel, Greta. Thanks so much.
That's great.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.